Good morning, this is Andy Bary from Washington State University. Today I'm going to talk about composting, the basics of composting with an introduction to purely contamination within your compost. So composting is the decomposition of organic materials by aerobic microorganisms under controlled conditions. And that means that we're using oxygen as the energy source and not different material, so that we have a nice smelling pile and we have an efficiently composting material. Here's 3 examples of compost. We have an aerated static pile here. You can see the blowers. Down here to the right, this is at the WSU Golf facility. This is some turned windrows down here. And then at the bottom, another small turned pile that's on a small farm in Olympia, Washington. So here's the basics of what goes on during the composting process. We start with organic matter. We start with minerals. We start with water. We start with microorganisms. And you add those all together. You mix them up. You put them into a pile. This pile will start using oxygen. It'll get hot and give off heat, give off water as water vapor, and give off during the process, composting process, you give off CO2. And so everything's coming along nicely. When you're done, you have what you begin with. You have organic matter, you have minerals, you have water, and you have microbes. You have a material that's easier to deal with and has a better nutrient profile with it. And also you've given up 40 to 60% of your volume during the composting process. So here's the number of issues that we're going to be looking at that make up compost piles that are important for compost pile operation. We have reasonable ranges, and we have preferred ranges. And all of these will work. It just depends on how the activity of your compost and how things are going to work. So we're going to start by covering a little bit about carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's always abbreviated as C to N ratio. Water content, how much water is in your compost pile. Oxygen, how much oxygen is in your pile. Particle size, and then temperature. All these are important aspects of composting that you need to take into effect when building compost piles. Here we have a theoretical temperature profile from a compost pile. We start with a bacterial driven system during the mesophilic stage, where all the easy to break down materials such as sugars are broken down and used for feed sources. And then as things start to come along, the pile gets hot. You get into this thermophilic stage that above 131 degrees. And you continue to compost. Both the mesophilic and the thermophilic stage here are generally bacterial driven, where when you get past the thermophilic stage, temperatures begin to moderate, and you go into curing and you go into maturation. And as you're going this way along this down slope, become more fungal driven pile. And we'll show you some real temperature response curves later on in the presentation. So you can see that they don't all look perfect like this. So we have 4 different phases. We have the mesophilic stage, which is characterized by moderate temperature and lasts for a few days in a good aerobic pile. And then once you've gone through the mesophilic stage, you go into the thermophilic stage, which is characterized by high temperature and lasts for a few days, several weeks, depending on the feedstocks you have, and how much energy you have in your pile. And then also you have, after that, you go to the curing and maturation. These are generally characterized by moderate to ambient temperatures. And these can last from 1 month to 2 months, up to 6 months or more, depending on the energy of your pile and how often you're going to use your pile. For a compost that I make here, generally what I do is I make it in the fall. It'll sit all the way through till next spring before I use it. So it's like 6 months old rather than just 2 months old. And that's what works for me. And that may work for you on your farm. So here's carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you want to start with a reasonable carbon to nitrogen ratio of your pile. The lower the C to N ratio there is, the higher the available plant nutrients are, particularly nitrogen, for looking at available nitrogen. Then we have things that have a high C to N ratio, are characterized by a high C to N and usually drier, and also make better bulking agents than some of these lower C to N ratios. These things that are lower C to N ratios have that ick factor to them. They're generally stinky, smelly, and disgusting, where the things with higher C to N ratios, generally wood product or straw, that are generally drier and don't have nearly the odor, so they're helping for odor control. When you're talking about C to N ratio, it's always some number to 1, and you'll see it in a couple different methods. You'll see it here where it's like 15 to 1, or sometimes they'll tell you the C to N ratio is 15, and it's always to 1. So that's the what's going on with C to N ratio. Moisture content is also very important in dealing with your pile. You don't want to be too dry, you don't want to be too wet. We don't want to be too dry because what you want to do is get your microbes, your bacteria to move around your pile and break down the different amount of organic matter in your pile. So you really want to make those happy. In a composting pile, what you're trying to do, become a microbe farmer and make those microbes happy and make them compost most efficiently way we can. You get to a too wet pile and you don't have enough oxygen for aerobic microbes to maintain, and you'll get things that produce foul odor. So what'll happen is your pore space will get filled up with water. There'll be no place for oxygen, so you'll go anaerobic and you produce generally hydrogen sulfide materials, which would be very stinky. This is an example of checking for moisture content. What you do is you grab a handful of your material, squeeze it, and if moisture runs out like this, you have too much moisture in it. What you only want to get is a few drops coming out here to the bottom, and then that, by squeezing it, that would be the perfect amount of water for your compost pile. Excuse me. You can see here that we've got two systems here. We have an aerobic and anaerobic. We're really shooting for an aerobic system. Those that have oxygen in it, where the microbes are using oxygen as part of their energy transformation steps and producing a nice compost. So they're using organic matter as a feedstock, using oxygen as a feedstock, as a feed additive, and composting very nicely during an aerobic system. With an anaerobic system, what you start is instead of using oxygen as an energy source, using sulfur as an energy source in this case. And what you'll get is hydrogen sulfide formation. So you get that stinky smell of putrid grass. That's probably the best. Grass piled up will go anaerobic, and you'll definitely, you'll smell the hydrogen sulfide. So you're really not looking for this situation, looking for where you have the oxygen in it that moderates temperatures. So for pathogen reduction, you'll hear this term, process to further reduce pathogen. It's usually abbreviated by PFRP, and almost everybody will refer to this as PFRP, but it's a process to further reduce pathogens. So there's a couple of different methods that can be used to reduce pathogens. And that is in a turn windrow pile like we have up top here. You need to have 15 days above 131 degrees with 5 turns. And from that, that'll give you, it may take you 20, 25 days to get 15 days above 131 degrees with 5 turns. So they don't have to be consecutive, because sometimes when you turn your pile, you may get a drop in temperature for a day or two before it regains composting and comes back up above 131 degrees. So you need to be monitoring your temperature as well as your moisture content, because both of these can play a role in your compost pile. Or we have an aerated static pile where we provide air coming out the bottom, blowing up through this pile. And for that, we need 3 days above 131 degrees for proper composting for pathogen reduction. So we have the two different types. We have aerated static pile and the turned windrow. We're going to talk about aerated static pile here. Here's an example of a small aerated static pile where you have a bones of a blowing pipe, blowing air through your pile. Your pile will go on top of this pipe. These pipes that run on this way are perforated, so air can blow out of these from this blower. And then there's a timer here that turns the blower on and off, depending on the energy that is in your pile, to provide the right amount of oxygen for your organisms to grow to keep an aerobic pile. So there's a number of different items here that are important to consider when you're doing aerated static pile. Some of them overlap, some of them don't. Maintains aerobic conditions because you're blowing air through your pile. Controls objectionable odors. Manage piles temperature. You can turn on or off your pile depending on what's going on to monitor to get temperature where you want it. Expedites composting and curing, moves along quite nicely. Produces superior compost product. Changes your PFRP time from 15 days to 3 days. And you can have bigger piles because you're blowing air through the piles. So it's easier to have bigger piles. Moisture needs to be right from the get-go, because otherwise you then have to unbuild your pile, add moisture, and then rebuild your pile. So it's really a pain in the butt to do that. So you really want to make sure that you get that moisture content right from the get-go. And there is potential for over aerating here, which could then lead to heat or moisture loss and could be bad for your pile. You also have some disposable materials. These pipes don't last forever. You might get 1 year out of them. You may get 2 years out of them. It just depends on how much you compost and the type of pipe you by. The other downfall of this system, or benefit, depending on how you think about it, is that it requires electricity, because you give up some control by not having electricity, turning air on and off. So if you don't have if you have a site that doesn't have electricity, this method's not gonna work for you. So here's the two different systems we had: a turn windrow on the top, aerated static pile on the bottom. This is typical of what you see of an aerated static, of a turn windrow pile. High temperatures in the center, and then as you move out to the edge of the pile, it gets colder, below 131 degrees, which is why you have to mix this pile. You take the outside, it becomes the inside. All parts of the pile get exposed to 131 degrees, and this reduces the amount of pathogens from it. Whereas with a aerated static pile, you have the aerated pipes at the bottom, covered by a little plenum chamber to distribute the air. And you have all your raw feedstocks. And this is covered with a material that has no pathogens in it, either finished compost or wood product, or a material like that, similar material like that. And this acts as a temperature buffer so that all parts of the pile in here get above 131 degrees, where this outside does not, but it acts as a temperature barrier so the inside can get above 131 degrees. So turn windrow piles, you can control objectional odors, manage pile temperatures by turning them, or adding water, not adding water. It changes the PFRP time, goes to 15 days with 5 turns, or 20 to 25 days in reality by the time you deal with a little temperature drop. These are generally smaller piles. You can see here, these are not very big piles, and they're require a bigger footprint. Something I didn't mention with the aerated static pile requires a smaller footprint. This takes a bigger footprint. You got to be able to come in here and have a turner come in or a bucket loader come in. So it takes a lot more space. One of the benefits to this system is requires no electricity. Here's a couple of examples of real-time temperature profiles from a couple of studies I've had. It's one in the upper left-hand corner is a turned windrow pile. It happens to be chicken manure. A couple of different years for the study we were running. And you can see that every time we turn it, we get a drop in temperature, not always below 131 degrees, but frequently. But always we get a drop in temperature when we turn it. So this would definitely meet the turn, because every time we turn, we got 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, 4 turns, 5 turns. So we got the 5 turns in there. We got enough days above 131 degrees. In this case, it would have taken us 40 days to get through this pile. Chicken manure is fairly active, so it'll work out very well like that. Some other materials that don't have quite the energy signature with them, you want to get going a little quicker and get it done before you get to 40 days. And here's a turned windrow. Here's an aerated static pile. Let's see, we start out in the mesophilic stage. Within 3 days, we're above 131 degrees. Get into the pathogen reduction stage. We let it stay out here till somewhere between 45 and 60 days, depending on the year. This is a material that's it's a mixed compost. So it's a mixture of terry manure, yard waste, fair waste, chicken manure, and about 2,000 pounds of fish carcasses. And this pile here makes very nice compost. You can see we have a distinctive mesophilic stage followed by a thermophilic stage. The curing and maturation sort of blend in together, and you're not really quite as separated. And you don't see any curing or maturation stage here. That's really typical of chicken manure. Chicken manure can last a long time before you're going to get to a maturation or curing stage, but it works very well for nutrient availability in this standpoint here. So that sums up the basics to composting I'm going to talk about today. Now we're going to move on to clopyralid in compost. And clopyralid is a herbicide that's used in various crops and become a contamination. And dairy manure we're having quite a problem with it in yard debris. In the early 2000s, this method was solved by banning its use on homeowner standpoint using compost, but it's still used in other crops, so it's become a contamination recently. Actually, the year doesn't go by that I don't get a phone call about clopyralid contamination somewhere from within the United States. It's a herbicide that kills many broadleaf weeds, so it works very well on grasses, hay, wheat, corn, and some other crops. But it's going to kill not those crops, but it will kill the weeds in those crops. And so there's 2 products in this family. There's clopyralid and aminopyralid. They're each licensed, registered on different crops. So you want to check to make sure. On the label, it says you should not use material treated with this as a compost material, but it doesn't mean that always happens because we have contamination from it. Chlorpyrrolate is very slow to break down in compost, and it's active at very low concentrations. It controls legumes, nightshades, and composites from those families. Those are the ones that are most susceptible. So these are the ones where we'll see most problems when you use compost in those. So legumes would be peas and beans, nightshades would be tomatoes, composites would be something like lettuce. They all cause a problem. And depending on the species and the concentration will depend on how much effect you get from the contamination. It's chlorpyrrolate is active at less than 10 parts per billion on susceptible species, so you'll see symptoms down to 10 parts per billion. Chlorpyrrolate is applied to feeds or straw from bedding, such as small grains, straw from small grains, grass, hay, corn, and a few other crops. What happens are these are fed to cows or used for bedding on cows. Then the manure becomes a feedstock for compost. And if the materials that were used have had chlorpyrrolate applied to them, you're going to see it show up in your compost because compost doesn't break, chlorpyrrolate just doesn't break down very quickly in compost piles. The question is, will the contaminated compost kill my plants? No, but you may see symptoms of damage on susceptible garden species such as peas and beans and tomatoes. The crops will continue to grow, but they're not going to look normal. They don't really die, but they never really hit their fruition in producing crops. Most plants are unaffected by chlorpyrrolate, but there are a few that are big vegetables that are grown that definitely cause problems. So there's a couple of different ways to determine how much bioacid, if you have problems with chlorpyrrolate or aminopyrrolate in your compost pile. And that's either using a chemical analysis where you can pay to have it analyzed for chlorpyrrolate. This is very expensive. We're talking in the range of $200 per sample. Or you can do a greenhouse bioassay where you take and mix your compost in with two parts compost to 1 part peat-based potting mix, and then put those in small little 3-inch pots, plant some peas in there, and then watch the peas grow. There's a method I have up on my website. Here's the URL to it. Go to that website and it gives you further directions as to how to do a bioassay. The bioassay may be a little more sensitive than a chemical because you'll see if you're really having any problems from it. Here's an example of what you problems you get from chlorpyrrolate. The bottom 2 slides are a normal pea. They look perfectly normal and they look very nice. There's no problem with them. The top 2 slides are contaminated materials. And you can see we have curling and cupping of the different leaves is distinctive of chlorpyrrolate contamination and a couple other issues. But this would be reason enough to consider doing a chemical analysis. You got something like this, or not selling your material because you could have potential health problems. So here's an example of 4 different levels of contamination. Again, we have an uncontaminated crop here. We have a contaminated crop here with has slight damage, a little bit of curling, a little bit of cupping, not too bad. And then in moderate, we have more cupping, more twisting of leaves. Then we have the most severe, where we have lots of cupping, lots of curling. This is going to be a real big problem in the field. So there's a number of ways to check for chlorpyrrolate. It's really important that you do a bioassay of your material to determine if you have contamination, because it's not a situation you want to get involved with selling compost that has contamination, and it could cause you really big problems. So thank you very much. That ends my presentation today, and I'll take any questions shortly, and have a good day.